The stagecoach lurched to a violent stop in front of the Pioche, Nevada trading post, and Fiona Vaughn pressed her face against the dusty window, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right through her threadbare dress. She had traveled 3 weeks from St. Louis with nothing but the clothes on her back, a torn carpetbag that had seen better days decades ago, and a single crumpled letter from a man named Lucas Lancaster who needed a wife. The dress she wore had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches, and her shoes were held together with twine she had begged from a fellow passenger. The other women on the coach had whispered about her, their eyes sliding over her ragged appearance with barely concealed disgust. But Fiona held her head high because she had survived things that would have broken softer people. The driver opened the door, and she stepped down into the blazing September sun of 1883, squinting against the harsh light reflecting off the silver mine operations that dotted the hillsides around the rough mining town. Piach had seen better days. She could tell that immediately. The silver boom that had made it one of Nevada's most prosperous towns in the 1870s was clearly waning, and many of the buildings showed signs of neglect. Still, there was life here, rough and determined, and that was more than she had left behind in St. Louis, where her stepfather's debts had threatened to swallow her whole. She clutched her carpetbag and looked around, searching for the man whose letter had promised her a home, respect, and a chance at a new life. He had written that he ran a cattle ranch on the outskirts of town, that he was 26 years old, and that he needed a wife who was not afraid of hard work. Fiona was 22, and she had been working since she was old enough to hold a scrub brush, so that requirement did not frighten her. What frightened her was the possibility that he might take one look at her shabby appearance and send her back. "Miss Vaughn." The voice came from behind her, deep and cautious, and she turned to see a man standing in the shadow of the trading post awning. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical labor. His face was weathered and tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned. Those eyes were a startling blue, the color of the sky just after dawn, and they were looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Fiona Vaughn." He stepped forward into the light and she could see him more clearly now. He wore a simple cotton shirt that had been washed so many times it was soft and faded, dark trousers held up with suspenders, and boots that were scuffed but well cared for. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing dark brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. He was handsome in a rugged, honest way that made her heart skip, despite her nervousness. Lucas Lancaster looked at the woman standing before him and felt something shift in his chest. He had expected someone plain, someone desperate enough to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere. What he had not expected was the raw courage he saw in her green eyes, or the way she held herself with dignity, despite the fact that her dress was more patches than original fabric. She was thin, too thin, and her face was pale beneath a dusting of freckles, but there was a beauty in the set of her jaw and the determined tilt of her chin that took his breath away. "I know I'm not what you expected," Fiona said quickly, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to explain. "The journey was harder than I thought, and I had to sell most of what I owned just to afford the ticket. And I know my dress is terrible, but I'm a hard worker, Mr. Lancaster. I truly am. And I can cook and clean, and I'll do whatever needs doing, and I promise I won't be a burden to you." Lucas held up a hand to stop her nervous torrent of words. He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look up at him, and when he spoke his voice was gentle. "You're beautiful just as you are." Fiona stared at him, certain she had misheard. No one had ever called her beautiful, not even before her mother died and her stepfather started drinking away every penny they had. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out, and to her horror, she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I mean it," Lucas said, and now he smiled, a slow, warm smile that transformed his entire face. "I can see you've had a hard time of it, Miss Vaughn, but you're here now and that takes courage. Come on, let me get you home. We can talk more once you've had a chance to rest and eat something." He picked up her carpet bag, which weighed almost nothing, and gestured toward a wagon waiting at the end of the street. Fiona followed him on shaking legs, still trying to process what had just happened. He had not turned her away. He had not looked at her with disgust or disappointment. He had called her beautiful. The wagon ride to his ranch took about 30 minutes, and during that time, Lucas pointed out various landmarks around Piach. He showed her the mines that still operated, though not with the fervor of earlier years. He pointed out the church, a simple wooden structure that the various denominations shared, and the school where the town's children received their education. He talked about the harsh winters when snow could block the roads for weeks, and the hot summers when water became precious as gold. Fiona listened and watched him as he spoke. There was a quiet confidence about him, a steadiness that made her feel safe for the first time in years. He did not seem like a man who would raise his hand in anger or spend his money on whiskey while his family went hungry. She had learned to read people during her difficult years in St. Louis, and everything about Lucas Lancaster suggested he was exactly what his letters had promised, an honest man looking for an honest partnership. The ranch appeared on the horizon, a collection of buildings nestled against the base of a low hill. The main house was small but well built, with a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. There was a barn, a chicken coop, several corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse. Cattle grazed in the distance, brown and white shapes against the pale desert grass. "It's not much," Lucas said as he pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "But it's solid and it's paid for. I built most of it myself over the past 5 years. It's wonderful," Fiona said honestly. Compared to the cramped, dirty boarding house room she had shared with 3 other women in St. Louis, this ranch looked like a palace. Lucas helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure around her waist, and led her up the porch steps. The front door opened before they reached it, and a woman appeared, older and round-faced with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. "This is Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher," Lucas said. "She runs the boarding house in town, but she's been helping me get the house ready for your arrival." "Dorothy, this is Miss Fiona Vaughn." "Oh, you poor dear," Mrs. Fletcher said immediately, taking in Fiona's appearance with a practiced eye. "You look absolutely exhausted. Come in, come in. I've got stew on the stove and fresh bread, and after you've eaten we'll get you into a proper bath and find you something decent to wear." Fiona wanted to protest, to say she did not need charity, but the smell of the stew hit her, and her stomach growled so loudly that both Lucas and Mrs. Fletcher heard it. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Mrs. Fletcher just laughed and ushered her inside. The interior of the house was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture that looked handmade and curtains at the windows that let in the afternoon light. There was a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. Mrs. Fletcher sat Fiona down at the table and placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of her, along with a thick slice of bread slathered with butter. Fiona tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but she was so hungry that she could barely restrain herself. She had not had a proper meal in days, surviving on the small amount of hard cheese and stale crackers she had been able to afford. Lucas sat across from her, drinking coffee and watching her with those blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. "When did you last eat a full meal?" he asked quietly. Fiona swallowed her mouthful of stew and considered lying, but something about his direct gaze made her tell the truth. 5 days ago. There was an inn where the stagecoach stopped, and the owner took pity on me and gave me some soup. Lucas's jaw tightened, but he did not say anything, just nodded slowly. Mrs. Fletcher made a disapproving noise and immediately cut another slice of bread. "You'll eat your fill here, dear. Lucas always has plenty of food. He might live alone, but he cooks like he's feeding an army." They talked while Fiona ate, careful conversation that skated around the elephant in the room, which was the fact that she and Lucas were supposed to be married. Mrs. Fletcher did most of the talking, filling Fiona in on the town gossip and the various people she would need to know. Lucas mostly listened, occasionally adding a detail or clarification, and Fiona found herself relaxing despite the strangeness of the situation. After the meal, Mrs. Fletcher shooed Lucas out of the house so she could help Fiona with a bath. The older woman heated water on the stove and filled a large tin tub that she positioned in the smaller bedroom, which Fiona realized was meant to be hers, at least for now. "I know this is all very strange for you," Mrs. Fletcher said as she helped Fiona out of her ragged dress. "But Lucas is a good man, probably the best man in this whole rough town. His parents died when he was 19. Fever took them both within a week of each other, and he's been running this ranch alone ever since. He's honest and hardworking, and he doesn't drink or gamble or visit the saloon girls. He goes to church every Sunday, and he's helped half the people in Piach at one time or another without asking for anything in return." Fiona sank into the warm water with a sigh of pure bliss. Why does he need a mail-order bride? Surely there are women in town who would be happy to marry him. Mrs. Fletcher snorted. "There are, but not the kind of women Lucas wants. The decent women in Piach are either already married or they're too young. Lucas wrote to that matrimonial agency because he wanted someone who understood what it meant to work hard and build a life together. He doesn't want some silly girl who thinks being a rancher's wife means wearing pretty dresses and going to socials." She handed Fiona a bar of soap that smelled like lavender and started washing Fiona's hair with gentle efficiency. "He also wanted someone who would want to be here, someone who was choosing this life. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Fiona said softly. "It makes perfect sense." After the bath, Mrs. Fletcher produced 2 dresses from a bag she had brought with her. "These were mine when I was younger and thinner," she said with a self-deprecating laugh. "They're not fancy, but they're sturdy and they're whole, which is more than can be said for what you were wearing. I took the liberty of altering them a bit based on the measurements Lucas got from your letters. I hope they fit." The dresses fit reasonably well, needing only minor adjustments. One was a practical brown cotton suitable for everyday work, and the other was a deep green that brought out the color of Fiona's eyes. There were also undergarments, a nightgown, and a warm shawl. Fiona felt tears threatening again at the kindness of these strangers. "How can I ever repay you?" she asked. "By making Lucas happy," Mrs. Fletcher said simply. "That boy has been alone too long. He needs someone to share his life with, someone who'll appreciate what he's built here." When Fiona emerged from the bedroom wearing the brown dress with her damp hair braided down her back, Lucas was sitting at the table reading a newspaper. He looked up, and his eyes widened slightly, and Fiona saw something flicker in their depths that made her pulse quicken. "You look lovely," he said, standing up. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you. And thank you for the dresses and everything else. You've both been so kind." Mrs. Fletcher gathered her things and prepared to leave. I'll head back to town now and give you two some time to talk. Fiona, you come visit me at the boarding house anytime you like. And Lucas, you take good care of this girl." After she left, an awkward silence fell over the house. Fiona and Lucas looked at each other across the room, both acutely aware that they were now alone together, two strangers who were supposed to become husband and wife. Lucas cleared his throat. "I thought we should talk about expectations," he said. "I know this is an unusual situation, and I don't want you to feel pressured into anything. The smaller bedroom is yours for as long as you want it. We can get married whenever you're ready, or not at all if you decide this isn't what you want. I'll pay for your passage back to St. Louis if that's what you choose." Fiona moved closer to him, studying his face in the fading afternoon light. "What do you want, Mr. Lancaster?" "Lucas," he corrected gently. "I want you to call me Lucas." "What do you want, Lucas?" He met her gaze directly. "I want a partner. Someone to build a life with, to share the work and the rewards. I want children eventually if we're blessed with them. I want someone I can talk to at the end of the day, someone who'll be there through the hard times and the good times. And I hope that over time we might come to care for each other as more than just partners." "Love, you mean?" Fiona said. "Yes, love," he smiled slightly. "I know that might sound foolish given that we just met, but I'm an optimist. I think love can grow between two people who respect each other and work together toward common goals." Fiona thought about her options. She could go back to St. Louis, back to the boarding house and her stepfather's creditors and the constant fear of where her next meal would come from. Or she could stay here with this kind, honest man who looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. "I would like to stay," she said. "And I would like to marry you if you still want to marry me after seeing me in person." Lucas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "Fiona, I told you on the street and I'll tell you again. You're beautiful just as you are. Your circumstances don't define you. The fact that you've survived hard times and still have the courage to start fresh, that's what matters to me." The sincerity in his voice made something crack open inside Fiona's chest, something that had been locked away for years. She squeezed his hand. "When should we get married?" "How about this Sunday? That gives you a few days to settle in and make sure you really want to go through with this. Reverend Thompson can perform the ceremony after the regular service. This Sunday would be perfect." They spent the evening talking, really talking, sharing their histories and their hopes for the future. Lucas told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father teaching him to work with cattle and his mother teaching him to read and write and think for himself. He talked about the grief of losing them both so suddenly, and the determination that had kept him going through the lonely years that followed. Fiona told him about her childhood, about her mother's death when she was 12, and her stepfather's subsequent descent into alcoholism and debt. She told him about the jobs she had worked, the houses she had cleaned, the laundry she had scrubbed until her hands bled. She told him about the day she had found the advertisement for the matrimonial agency and had spent her last few dollars on having someone write a letter for her because her own writing skills were limited. "You can't write?" Lucas asked, surprised. "I can write a little, enough to sign my name and read simple words, but my mother died before she could teach me properly, and my stepfather certainly wasn't going to pay for schooling." "I'll teach you," Lucas said immediately. "I have books and I was always decent at teaching. My mother used to say I had the patience for it." Fiona felt that crack in her chest widen a little more. Every time Lucas spoke, every small kindness he offered made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could belong. That night she lay in her small bedroom, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. She heard cattle lowing in the distance, the wind rustling through the scrub brush, and somewhere an owl hooting. It was so different from the city noises she was used to, the constant clatter of wagons and shouts of people and clanging of machinery. This was peaceful, almost serene, and she found herself relaxing into the comfortable bed with its clean sheets and warm quilts. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Lucas showed her around the ranch, introducing her to the daily routines and teaching her about the cattle. He had about 50 head, he explained, which was not a large herd but enough to provide a steady income when he drove them to market. He also kept chickens for eggs, a milk cow, and a large vegetable garden that was currently yielding the last of the summer crops. Fiona threw herself into learning everything she could. She collected eggs, learned to milk the cow, weeded the garden, and helped Lucas prepare feed for the cattle. The work was hard but honest, and she went to bed each night with tired muscles and a sense of satisfaction she had never felt while scrubbing other people's floors. Lucas was patient with her, showing her how to do things and never making her feel stupid when she made mistakes. He taught her to recognize the different cattle by their markings, to tell when the chickens were healthy or stressed, to judge when vegetables were ripe enough to pick. He also started teaching her to read better, spending an hour each evening after dinner working through a primer with her. "You're smart," he told her one evening as she successfully read an entire page with only a few stumbles. "You just never had the opportunity to learn properly, but you pick things up fast." Fiona glowed under his praise. She had spent so long being told she was worthless, being treated like she was less than human, that every kind word from Lucas felt like a gift. Sunday arrived with clear skies and pleasant temperatures. Fiona wore the green dress that Mrs. Fletcher had given her, and Lucas wore his best suit, which was a bit old-fashioned but clean and well-maintained. They drove into Piach in the wagon, sitting side by side on the bench seat, and Fiona felt her nervousness increasing with every turn of the wheels. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas asked as they neared the town. "It's not too late to change your mind." Fiona looked at him, at his honest face and his kind eyes and his strong hands holding the reins. She thought about the days she had spent at the ranch, the peace she had felt there, the sense of being valued that Lucas gave her simply by treating her like a person who mattered. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I want to marry you, Lucas Lancaster." His smile was brighter than the Nevada sun. The church was small and only about half full when they arrived. Mrs. Fletcher was there, beaming at them from the front pew. There were a handful of other townspeople, curious about Lucas's mail-order bride, their faces showing varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Fiona held her head high and ignored the whispers, focusing instead on Lucas's solid presence beside her. Reverend Thompson was a thin man in his 50s with a gentle demeanor and a slight stutter. He seemed genuinely happy to be performing the ceremony, smiling at them both as they stood before him at the simple altar. The ceremony was brief and traditional. Fiona had no ring to give Lucas, but he produced a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother and slipped it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. His voice was strong and clear as he repeated the vows, promising to love and cherish her for the rest of his life. When it came time for Fiona to say her vows, she looked up into Lucas's blue eyes and spoke from her heart. "I promise to be a good wife to you, Lucas. I promise to work hard and stand by you and be faithful to you all my days. I promise to cherish this chance you've given me and to do everything I can to make you happy." Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, and Lucas leaned down to kiss her. It was a chaste kiss, just a brief press of his lips against hers, but it sent a shiver through Fiona's entire body. She was married. She was Mrs. Lucas Lancaster now, and she had a home and a future. Mrs. Fletcher hosted a small gathering at her boarding house after the ceremony, with sandwiches and cake and coffee. Several townspeople attended, mostly out of curiosity, and Fiona found herself being politely interrogated by the town's matrons. Where was she from? What had her people done? How had she met Lucas? She answered as best she could, keeping her responses truthful but brief. She saw no need to advertise how desperate her circumstances had been, though she suspected the state of her arrival had already made that clear to everyone. To her relief, most of the women seemed willing to give her a chance, perhaps swayed by Lucas's obvious good reputation. "You've done well for yourself," one older woman told her bluntly. "Lucas Lancaster is the best catch in 3 counties. You make sure you treat him right." "I intend to," Fiona replied with equal bluntness, and the woman nodded with approval. The sun was setting as they drove back to the ranch, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Fiona leaned against Lucas's shoulder, feeling the warmth of him through his jacket, and allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in years. "Hope, are you tired?" Lucas asked as they pulled up to the house. "A little. It's been an eventful day." He helped her down from the wagon, and they stood together in the fading light, husband and wife, 2 people who were still essentially strangers but who had committed to building a life together. "Fiona," Lucas said softly, "I meant what I said in my vows. I will do everything in my power to make you happy and give you a good life. You never have to be afraid here. You never have to go hungry or worry about having a roof over your head. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Fiona reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his late-day stubble under her palm. "I know," she whispered. "I trust you, Lucas. I don't know why, given that we barely know each other, but I do." He turned his head and kissed her palm, a gesture so tender that it brought tears to her eyes. "Come on," he said. "Let's go inside. I imagine you'll want to rest." That night, Fiona slept in her small bedroom while Lucas slept in his, and she felt grateful for his patience. She knew that eventually their marriage would need to be consummated, that Lucas would expect and deserve a true wife in every sense of the word, but she appreciated that he was giving her time to adjust to her new circumstances. The weeks that followed established a comfortable routine. Fiona woke early each morning and prepared breakfast while Lucas did the initial ranch chores. They ate together, talking about the day's work, and then split up to handle their respective tasks. Fiona managed the garden and the chickens, did the cooking and cleaning, and worked on her reading lessons. Lucas handled the cattle and the heavier ranch work, constantly maintaining and improving the property. In the evenings they sat together, sometimes reading aloud to each other, sometimes just talking about everything and nothing. Lucas told her about his dreams for the ranch, his hope to expand the herd and maybe add some horses for breeding. Fiona told him about the books she wanted to read someday, the places she had heard about but never seen, the simple desire to have a garden full of flowers as well as vegetables. "We can plant flowers in the spring," Lucas said. "Roses by the porch, maybe. And I saw some wildflower seeds at the trading post that might do well here. You would do that for me. Plant flowers that serve no practical purpose. Of course. You deserve beautiful things, Fiona. Beauty isn't just practical, it feeds the soul." It was conversations like this that made Fiona realize she was falling in love with her husband. It was not the sudden, passionate love of storybooks, but rather a slow, steady growing affection built on respect and kindness and shared purpose. She loved the way he treated her like an equal partner, asking her opinion on ranch decisions and actually listening to her answers. She loved the way he made her laugh with dry observations about the townspeople or the cattle. She loved the way he never raised his voice in anger, even when things went wrong. One evening about 6 weeks after their wedding, Fiona was washing dishes when she felt Lucas come up behind her. He hesitated, and then gently placed his hands on her waist. She froze, her heart suddenly pounding, but she did not pull away. "Fiona," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I care for you deeply. These past weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I find myself thinking about you constantly, looking forward to meals just because I'll get to see you across the table, going to bed disappointed that you're not beside me." She turned in his arms to face him, her wet hands dripping on the floor. "Lucas, I'm in love with you," he said simply. "I know it might be too soon to say that, but it's the truth. I'm in love with you, Fiona, and I want us to be truly married in every way. But only if that's what you want too. I won't pressure you. I just needed you to know how I feel." Fiona looked up at his face, at the vulnerability in his expression, and felt her own heart open completely. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't know I could feel this way about anyone, but I do. I love you, Lucas." He kissed her then, not the chaste kiss of their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and passionate and full of promise. Fiona melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and allowed herself to feel the desire that had been building between them for weeks. That night, she moved into Lucas's bedroom, into his bed, and they came together as husband and wife in every sense of the word. Lucas was gentle and patient, making sure Fiona's first time was as comfortable as possible. And when she woke in the morning wrapped in his arms, she felt a contentment so profound, it almost frightened her. The ranch work continued, but now there was a new dimension to their relationship. They were not just partners but lovers, stealing kisses while doing chores, finding excuses to touch each other in passing, going to bed early with knowing smiles. Fiona bloomed under Lucas's love, gaining weight and color, her eyes losing their haunted look and gaining a sparkle that made her genuinely beautiful. Winter came to Piach, bringing cold temperatures and occasional snow. Fiona experienced her first truly white Christmas, marveling at the way the snow transformed the harsh desert landscape into something magical. Lucas gave her a book of poetry and a new dress he had commissioned from the town seamstress. She gave him a scarf she had knitted, her first successful attempt at the craft Mrs. Fletcher had been teaching her. They spent the short, dark days of winter working on indoor projects. Lucas built new furniture for the house, while Fiona sewed curtains and quilts. They read books together by the fireplace, discussed their plans for the spring, and made love frequently, finding comfort and pleasure in each other's bodies as the cold winds howled outside. In February, Fiona began feeling ill in the mornings. At first she thought it was something she had eaten, but when it continued day after day, Mrs. Fletcher, who had come to visit, took one look at her and laughed. "Oh, honey, you're pregnant. I'd bet my boarding house on it." Fiona's hands flew to her stomach, her eyes wide. "Pregnant, are you sure?" "When was your last monthly?" Fiona tried to remember and realized with a start that it had been nearly 3 months. With everything that had been happening, she had not even noticed the absence. "December," she said faintly. "Early December. Then you're probably about 3 months along. You should see Doc Morrison to be sure, but I've seen enough pregnant women to recognize the signs." Lucas was out checking the cattle when Mrs. Fletcher left, and Fiona spent the intervening hours in a daze. She was going to have a baby. Lucas's baby. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She had always wanted children, but she had never imagined it would happen like this, with a man she loved in a home she cherished. When Lucas came in for dinner, Fiona met him at the door, unable to contain her news any longer. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out. "Mrs. Fletcher says I'm about 3 months along and I need to see the doctor, but I think she's right, Lucas. I think we're going to have a baby." For a moment Lucas just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a huge grin spread across his face, and he let out a whoop of joy, picking her up and spinning her around despite her squealed protests. "A baby! We're going to have a baby!" He set her down carefully, suddenly solicitous. "Are you feeling all right? Should you be standing?" "Do you need to sit down?" Fiona laughed at his instant transformation into an overprotective husband. "I'm fine, Lucas. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'm not made of glass." But Lucas fussed over her anyway, insisting she sit while he finished preparing dinner, and that night he held her close and whispered his dreams for their child into her hair. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter. As long as the baby is healthy and you're healthy, that's all I care about." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Fiona continued doing her chores, though Lucas insisted on taking over the heavier tasks. She saw Doc Morrison, who confirmed that she was indeed expecting and that everything looked normal. The sickness faded after the first few months, and Fiona found herself feeling stronger and more energetic than ever before. Spring arrived in a burst of green as the desert plants responded to the winter rains. Fiona and Lucas planted their garden, including a flower bed near the porch that quickly filled with colorful blooms. The cattle had calves, the chickens hatched new chicks, and the ranch felt alive with growth and possibility. Fiona's belly swelled as the weeks passed, and she found herself constantly amazed by the life growing inside her. Lucas talked to her stomach every night, telling their child about the ranch and the cattle, and how loved the baby already was. Fiona would run her fingers through his hair and feel a happiness so intense it almost hurt. "I never thought I could have this," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "A home, a husband who loves me, a baby on the way. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in a room with 3 other women and wondering if I would starve before I could figure out how to escape my stepfather's debts. Now look at me." Lucas took her hand and kissed it. "You deserve all of this and more. You're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever met, Fiona. You survived terrible circumstances and still managed to keep your kindness and your hope. That's remarkable." In late August, when the heat was at its most intense, and Fiona felt like she could not possibly get any larger, the contractions started. Lucas rode into town to fetch Doc Morrison and Mrs. Fletcher, his face pale with worry, while Fiona paced the house and tried to remember everything the older women had told her about childbirth. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Fiona suffered through it with as much grace as she could muster, gripping Mrs. Fletcher's hand during the worst contractions and trying not to scream. Lucas stayed in the main room, pacing and worrying, jumping every time he heard her cry out. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, Fiona gave a final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. Doc Morrison held up a squalling, red-faced infant and grinned. "Congratulations, Mrs. Lancaster. You have a son. A son." Fiona held out her arms and the doctor placed the baby in them, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand to encompass this new person. He had Lucas's dark hair and her nose, and his eyes were squeezed shut against the light of the world. "Can Lucas come in now?" she asked, unable to look away from her son. Mrs. Fletcher opened the door and Lucas practically ran into the room. He stopped short when he saw Fiona holding the baby, and she saw tears streaming down his face. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "A son," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers immediately curled around his father's finger, and Lucas let out a choked laugh. "He's perfect, Fiona. He's absolutely perfect." They named him Lawrence Fletcher Lancaster, Lawrence for Lucas's father and Fletcher for Mrs. Fletcher, who had been such a help to them. Little Lawrence, who they immediately started calling Laurie, was a good baby, quick to smile and relatively calm. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's red hair, and both parents were hopelessly besotted with him. The first months of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. Fiona discovered reserves of energy she did not know she possessed, getting up multiple times each night to feed Laurie and still managing to keep up with most of her chores. Lucas helped whenever he could, walking the floor with a fussy baby so Fiona could sleep, changing diapers without complaint, making silly faces to elicit those precious baby smiles. "I never knew I could love anyone as much as I love you," Lucas told Fiona one night as they watched Laurie sleeping in his cradle. "But now there's Laurie too, and somehow my heart has room for both of you. It's like it just keeps expanding." Fiona leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him against her side. "I know. Sometimes I look at what we've built together and I can hardly believe it's real. A year ago I was in rags, starving and desperate. Now I have everything I ever dreamed of and more." As Laurie grew, the ranch continued to thrive. Lucas expanded the herd as he had dreamed, and they hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heavier work. Fiona's garden flourished, providing vegetables for their table and extras to sell in town. She also started raising bees, producing honey that became popular among the townspeople. Fiona had become an accepted member of the Piach community, her early poverty forgotten in light of her obvious hard work and devotion to her family. She attended church socials and helped with town projects, and she had developed real friendships with several of the other ranchers' wives. When Laurie was 2 years old, Fiona discovered she was pregnant again. This time she recognized the signs immediately, and she and Lucas celebrated with quiet joy. They were more prepared this time, knowing what to expect, though Lucas was no less protective than he had been during her first pregnancy. Their second child, a daughter they named Frances Virginia Lancaster after Fiona's mother and Lucas's mother, arrived in the spring of 1887 with much less drama than her brother had. Frances, called Franny from the start, had her mother's green eyes and her father's serious expression, and she ruled the household from the moment she entered it. Life settled into a rhythm of seasons and cycles, of planting and harvesting, of cattle drives and quiet winters. Laurie grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning about the ranch and the cattle with an eagerness that made Lucas glow with pride. Franny was a handful, bold and fearless, climbing everything in sight and giving her parents constant heart attacks with her adventures. Fiona often thought about the scared, desperate woman who had stepped off that stage coach in her ragged dress, and she could hardly recognize herself in that memory. She had gained confidence and strength, learning to read fluently and even helping teach at the town school occasionally. She had friends and a thriving home and a husband who still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. One evening, about 5 years after their wedding, Fiona and Lucas sat on their porch watching the sunset while Laurie and Franny played in the yard. The ranch had grown significantly. The house had been expanded with 2 additional bedrooms, and there was talk in town of the railroad finally extending a line to Pioche, which would open up new markets for their cattle. "You remember what you said to me the day I arrived?" Fiona asked Lucas, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I said a lot of things that day. You said I was beautiful just as I was. I was standing there in my terrible dress with my carpet bag that had holes in it, and you looked at me like I was something precious." Lucas kissed the top of her head. "You were precious. You are precious. And I meant what I said then, and I mean it now. You're beautiful, Fiona, Not because of how you look, though you're lovely, but because of who you are. Your strength, your kindness, your courage. That's what I saw that day, and that's what I see now." Fiona turned to kiss him properly, still marveling that this was her life, that this good man was her husband, and those children playing in the yard were hers, and this ranch was her home. "I love you, Lucas Lancaster. I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you, Fiona Lancaster. You're the best thing that ever happened to me." They sat together in the fading light, watching their children play, and Fiona felt a peace so profound that she sent up a silent prayer of thanks. She had come to Nevada as a desperate woman in rags, with nothing to offer but her willingness to work hard, and she had found everything she had ever wanted: love, security, family, purpose. She had found home. The years continued to pass in this contented fashion. Laurie grew tall and strong like his father, taking on more responsibility around the ranch as he matured. Franny remained a whirlwind of energy, but she developed a talent for working with the horses and spent hours training them with a patience that belied her otherwise impulsive nature. When Laurie was 10 and Franny was 8, Fiona gave birth to twin boys, Edward and Emmett, who brought a new level of chaos and joy to the household. Lucas built an even larger addition to the house to accommodate their growing family, and they hired additional help for the ranch, which now boasted over 200 head of cattle and a thriving horse breeding operation. Fiona had become known throughout the county for her honey and her beautiful gardens. She had also started writing, first just letters to friends, but eventually small articles about ranch life that were published in newspapers in larger towns. Her childhood poverty and limited education seemed like distant memories, replaced by the confidence of a woman who had built a life through determination and love. The railroad did eventually come to Piach, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. The town grew and modernized, though it never lost its rough frontier character. The Lancaster Ranch thrived through it all, becoming one of the most successful operations in the region. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Fiona into town for dinner at the newly built hotel, a luxury that would have been unimaginable in their early days. They dressed in their finest clothes and left the children in the care of Thomas and his wife, who now lived in the expanded bunkhouse with their own growing family. As they sat across from each other in the hotel dining room, eating food they had not prepared themselves and drinking wine from real crystal glasses, Fiona reflected on the decade that had passed. 10 years, she said wonderingly. 10 years since I arrived in my rags. Best decision I ever made, placing that advertisement, Lucas said, raising his glass to her. Best decision you ever made too, answering it. I think we can agree it was mutually beneficial, Fiona said with a smile, though I think I got the better end of the deal. You're still the best man I've ever known, Lucas, and you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, inside and out. They returned home late that night to find all 4 children asleep and the house quiet. They stood together in the doorway of each child's room, looking at their sleeping faces, and Fiona felt a contentment so deep it was almost spiritual. We did well, she whispered to Lucas. We built something good here. We did, he agreed, pulling her close, and we're not done yet. We have years ahead of us still, years to watch these children grow and to grow old together. Time proved Lucas right. The children grew into fine young adults. Laurie took over much of the ranch management, showing a natural aptitude for business that pleased his father immensely. Franny married a neighboring rancher's son and started her own horse training business. The twins, Edward and Emmett, both went to college, something that would have been impossible without the success of the ranch, and returned with new ideas for modernizing their operations. Fiona and Lucas aged together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays, weathered droughts and harsh winters, mourned losses and celebrated triumphs. They became grandparents, then great-grandparents, the ranch house always full of family and laughter. On their 30th wedding anniversary, when they were both in their 50s, Lucas took Fiona back to the Pioche trading post where he had first met her. The town had changed dramatically in 3 decades, but the trading post was still there, though it now sold different goods for a more modern clientele. "I stood right here," Lucas said, pointing to a spot under the awning. "I was so nervous. I didn't know what to expect, and then you stepped off that stagecoach, and I thought you were the bravest person I had ever seen." "I was terrified," Fiona admitted. "I thought you would take one look at me and send me back. Never. I knew from the moment I saw you that you were special." And I was right. He took her hand, the same hand where she still wore his mother's gold wedding band, now accompanied by an anniversary band he had given her on their 10th anniversary. 30 years, Fiona. 30 years of building a life together, and I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Fiona squeezed his hand, looking up at the man who had taken a chance on a desperate woman in rags and given her the world. His hair was more gray than brown now, and there were deep lines around his eyes, but he was still the same Lucas who had whispered that she was beautiful just as she was. "I love you," she said simply. Then, now, always. They continued their work on the ranch for many more years, gradually handing over responsibilities to their children but never fully retiring. They were fixtures in the Piach community, respected elders who had seen the town through its boom and its decline and its slow, steady rebuilding. When Lucas was 72 and Fiona was 68, he suffered a stroke that left him weak but still lucid. Fiona nursed him through his recovery, just as she had promised in her wedding vows to be there through sickness and health. He regained some of his strength but never fully recovered, and they both knew their time together was growing short. One evening, sitting on the porch that had seen so many sunsets and so many conversations, Lucas took Fiona's hand. "No regrets," he said, his voice weaker than it had once been but still firm. "Not a single one. You gave me the best life a man could ask for." "You gave me everything," Fiona replied, tears streaming down her face. "You saved me, Lucas. You looked at me when I had nothing and you saw something worth loving." "I saw exactly what was there," he corrected gently. "A beautiful, brave, remarkable woman. I was lucky you chose me." Lucas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 weeks later, with Fiona holding his hand, and their children and grandchildren gathered around the bed. Fiona grieved deeply but without regret, knowing that they had been blessed with nearly 50 years together. Years filled with more love and happiness than most people experienced in multiple lifetimes. She continued living on the ranch, refusing to move in with any of her children, insisting she could still manage with a little help. She tended her gardens, kept bees, wrote letters to her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and thought often about the man who had changed her life with a few simple words. On what would have been their 53rd wedding anniversary, Fiona stood at the trading post again, now an old woman with silver hair and a face lined by decades of laughter and hard work. She thought about the scared girl she had been, the rags she had worn, the desperation that had driven her across the country to marry a stranger. And she thought about Lucas, waiting for her under that awning, seeing past her poverty to the person she really was. He had given her everything: love, family, security, purpose. But most importantly, he had given her the gift of seeing herself through his eyes, of understanding that she had always been worthy of love and respect, even when circumstances had stripped her of everything else. Fiona lived to the age of 83, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that she had lived a good life full of love and purpose. When she passed peacefully in her sleep, she was buried next to Lucas on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. At her funeral, her eldest son Laurie stood before the gathered family and told the story of how his parents had met. He told them about the woman in rags who stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but courage, and the cowboy who whispered that she was beautiful just as she was. He told them about the love that had grown between two strangers, the family they had raised, and the legacy they had left behind. "They taught us that love isn't about finding someone perfect," Laurie said, his voice breaking. "It's about seeing the perfection in someone who has been beaten down by life and helping them stand tall again. It's about choosing each other every day, through good times and hard times, and building something meaningful together. That's what Mom and Dad did, and that's the example they left for all of us." The Lancaster Ranch continued for generations after Fiona's death, passed down through the family she and Lucas had created. And the story of how it all began, with a desperate woman in rags and a kind cowboy who saw her true worth, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as a testament to the power of love, courage, and the willingness to take a chance on happiness. In the end, Fiona Vaughn Lancaster had arrived as a mail-order bride with nothing, and she had died surrounded by everything that mattered: family, love, and the knowledge that she had been cherished exactly as she was from the very first moment. The ragged dress was long forgotten, but the words Lucas had spoken on that dusty street in Pioche, Nevada in 1883 echoed through the decades. "You're beautiful just as you are." And in being seen that way, in being loved that way, Fiona had found not just a home but herself, and had built a legacy that would endure far beyond her years.